here today, you came at a good time because we're starting a new series of messages I've entitled Toxic Culture. And standing strong in a toxic culture. It's a study of the second letter to Timothy by the Apostle Paul. And this is going to be, about a 6-week series of messages, and you're here at the outset. So we thank you for that. As you know, maybe you don't know, a couple weeks ago I was in Disneyland. And one thing about Disneyland, you feel safe and it's clean. But it is the picture of American consumerism. I can tell you we live in a culture of consumerism. We live in a culture of entertainment. We are an entertainment-driven culture. Highest paid people are athletes and actors. LeBron James makes $77.2 million a year. How about that? The highest paid actors were this last year. I looked online. Robert Downey Jr. made $75 million this last year. Wish you were in our church. He'd give 10%, right? And Emma Stone made only $26 million, but she was the highest paid female actor. See that difference there? There's something wrong with that, isn't there? But we live in a culture of hedonism. We live in a culture of abuse. We live in a culture of racial tension. We live in a culture that lacks civility when it comes to political discourse. I think you can agree. Maybe you can affirm this quote by the CEO of Disney. Bob Iger says, "Today we are losing ground. Hate and anger are dragging us toward the abyss." Ooh, what a picture. Apathy is actually growing. What is apathy? Who cares? How often have you heard the question, what has happened to our country? Better yet, how often have you asked that same question for yourself? Would you raise your hand if you would ask that question? Have you asked what is going on in our country, in our state, in our city, in our county? Yes, we are in agreement. He goes on. The disruptive force of technology is transforming our world in many good ways indeed, but also in ways that make it far too easy to deny our shared humanity. We must once again renounce and reject hate in all of its forms. And so Easter Sunday was last Sunday, right? I had not read the paper before I came to church because I don't usually do. I don't do that. So I get home and I realize that attack in Sri Lanka of those Christian churches. And on Easter Sunday, people died because they were Christians, as well as the tourists in those 3 hotels. It was horrible. And then yesterday it happened in a synagogue. I mean, we live in a culture where there is hate taking place and violence. So today we begin this series, and I want to begin by defining what I mean by toxic culture. And we're going to look at how Paul identifies the traits of toxic culture to the young protege Timothy. So culture is simply, by definition, the common beliefs, customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or social group. So your family has a culture, right? This church has a culture. Carmichael has a culture. It's all of what we do together. The word toxic comes from the Greek word toxin. Literally, it means poison for arrows. So you get the idea. It's something that's coming from outside of you that is not good for you. It's noxious, it's dangerous, it's unsafe, it's venomous, injurious, unfriendly, destructive, and harmful. So if you get exposed to a chemical toxin, which was on the news just the other night, a bunch of people got hospitalized because of this chemical truck leaked. That toxin, when it enters your body, will alter the normal function of your body. You're going to get sick. It may kill you. And so it's something that we're well aware of. So in today's world, we talk about not just toxic chemicals, but we talk about toxic people. You know those people, right? They're jealous, they're judgmental, they're critical, manipulative, negative. These are from Psychology Today. They're passive-aggressive. They keep you from living a productive and healthy life. This is a toxic person. Hopefully you don't know anybody like that. And then in the paper last week, I forgot to bring it, the toxic cocktail was on the front page. And what was toxic cocktail? It's not something that you drink, it's the water in paradise. Paradise burned, but their water is bad, and they don't know what to do about it. It's a toxic cocktail. Then online, I looked up other words for toxic, and I found out that there's toxic dental floss and toxic deodorant. I hope I don't have it on today, but I do have it on. I don't know. And then we know about toxic waste. We hear about it in the news. It's not just buried in Nevada, but it was at McClellan, right? When McClellan was decommissioned as an air base, that place was declared a toxic waste site, and they had to clean it up before they could redo it. So we're aware of those things. Toxic and culture going together. So I want to introduce you to the characters that we're going to talk about. 2 Timothy is a letter to Timothy, and it was written by who else but the Apostle Paul. He is the greatest church planter and missionary that spread the Christian faith in this first century throughout the Mediterranean region. On both sides of the coast, he was going from town to town, preaching and planting churches there. He is, if you didn't know this, the author of 13 of the New Testament books of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not his, but Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, all written by the Apostle Paul. He writes this letter to Timothy 67 AD, 66, 67 AD. Why do we know that? Because he was in jail. Under Nero, he was in jail in a cold Roman dungeon. And in the last chapter, he says to Timothy, please come and visit me in jail, and bring my coat, because it's cold here. He also says in his last words that, the time of my departure has come. My death is imminent. So that makes 2 Timothy what? His last words. And usually people say important things in their last words. And so this is why we're studying this book. Who was Timothy? He was simply a loyal and trusted co-worker with Paul. He was a mixed-race young man. His father was Greek. His mother was Jewish. He was trained and taught about the Christian faith from his grandmother, thank you, grandmother, and his mother. And somehow he met Paul, and he decided, and Paul looked at him, you'd be a good apprentice, and come with me. And they began to travel about evangelizing in Macedonia and Achaia. You can read about this in the book of Acts. He accompanied Paul to Ephesus and Corinth and Jerusalem. So he was a traveling companion with Paul. He was watching Paul preach and plant churches. He was even the co-sender. Paul would say, this is a letter to the church at Ephesus from Paul and Timothy, and so forth. And Timothy's major job, as we learn, was to go back to these fledgling congregations. People became Christians in a certain place, and Paul said, now, Timothy, you go back, and you meet with that little church, probably in a house, and you help them appoint elders. Help them get organized so that they can become effective congregations in worship, fellowship, discipleship, ministry, and mission. That was his job. Maybe he had the gift of administration, and he could go in and help these fledgling congregations get their act together and survive. So now let's go to the actual text that I begin with. And I don't preach through books of the Bible starting with verse 1, chapter 1. I'm going to go thematically through this book. So I'm going to start in chapter 3, folks. I'm going to start in chapter 3 because there I find why Paul is writing. Because Timothy is living in a toxic culture. And so here it is described for us in chapter 3, verses 1 and following. Paul says, Timothy, mark this. Know this. Pay attention to this. Note this. That there will be terrible times in the last days. What days are those? Yeah, right now. Theologically, biblically, the last days started when Jesus came. He began, his coming, his birth, his life was the start of a period called the last days. The last day will come when he returns the second time. Do you believe that Jesus is coming again? Well, that marks the end of this period called the last days. So that's what Paul and Timothy are in the last days. And guess what? So are you and I. We live in the last days. So he's talking about now to us. He says, terrible times will come in the last days. That means that which is coming is intensive and extensive as the day approaches of Christ's return. And what does he say about these last days? People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Whew, that's a mouthful. 18 different vices he calls about and describes the culture, and then I'm going to pick a couple vices in chapter 1, a couple of them in chapter 2, and then in chapter 4 he brings a few more in. And so instead of going through 18 of these today, we would be here quite a while, I'm going to lump them together into 4 categories, help you understand and help me talk about them, because Paul does repeat himself. And so we're going to look at toxic culture in 4 different ways, bringing these lists together into 4 categories. Number 1, he talks about a culture that is misdirected in love. Write that in, misdirected in love. He says people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money. They won't love others. They won't love good. They love pleasure rather than loving God. 6 times he uses the word love, positive and negatively. So he says in a toxic culture, you have people who have taken the gift from God. God is love, and we love because he first loved us. And how did he communicate his love to us? But in Christ, in Jesus, his selfless life of service and his sacrificial death on the cross. This is the definition biblically of love. But in this culture, they take that gift and they misuse it, and they direct that love toward themselves, toward money, toward pleasure. And when people love themselves, it means that they put themselves on the throne of their lives and at the center of the universe. Here's the picture of the throne. And the S means self is on the throne, and everything else is outside and subservient to the self. When people love themselves, they are what? Breaking the 2 greatest commandments. Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor. Not love yourself. Love your neighbor and love God. This is the evidence of a toxic culture. When people put pleasure on the throne, when people put pleasure as the priority of their life, and they seek physical comfort and sensuous experiences of their mind and body, this is hedonism. And it is rampant in toxic culture. When people put money on the throne, Paul says the love of money is the root of all evil. Money is not. It's neutral. But to love money above everything else, to have money on the throne, will cause you to lie and to cheat and to gamble and to embezzle and even to take another life, to murder. When people put self, they put money, they put pleasure where God should be, they break the first commandment, which is to have no other gods before me, which is the sin of idolatry. And Pastor J.D. Greer, megachurch pastor on the East Coast, he says, and idolatry is the source of a lot of our problems. It all goes back to who's on the throne. Who's on the throne? And all moral corruption follows from love falsely directed. This is the symptom of a toxic culture. Next, negative attitudes. We put all the attitudes together. An attitude of boasting, pride, conceit, ungrateful, unforgiving, unloving, disrespect, disobedience to parents. And so we'll start with boasting. It is simply verbal self-promotion. Then pride. Pride is the excessive belief in one's own abilities, and it interferes with your ability to recognize the grace of God. It is a preoccupation with yourself, and pride is the first and foremost of sins. It leads to all the others in your life. And James says God opposes the proud. What other attitudes are there? Ungrateful, unforgiving. This means that they are not thankful for anything. They do not operate with us. They don't wake up and look at the beautiful flowers and say, thank you, God, for that. It doesn't mean anything to them. They are unforgiving, meaning that they are stubborn when it comes to reconciling with others. How many times have I had people come to me, wives particularly, saying to me, my husband will not go to counseling. They will not. They will not come. They won't even come to my office in conflict. If the two of them would come together, we could solve the problem. But no, they are unwilling to seek forgiveness and restitution. This is a characteristic of this time. They are unloving. They are hard-hearted and unfeeling toward other words. In other words, they don't love good. That means they're not going to be a good Samaritan. Okay, you know that story? A good Samaritan sees somebody in need and says, the right thing to do is to stop and to help them. But in this culture, no, they don't love good. So they won't be a good Samaritan. They will walk by and leave you in the ditch. This is a characteristic attitude of this. And they disrespect authority, especially parental authority, as Paul indicates here. But it is a reference to all forms of authority, specifically here, children's disobedience to their parents. Negative stuff, negative attitudes. Then actions. Actions that are harmful. He says people will be abusive and slanderous without self-control, brutal, treacherous, rash. They will indulge quarreling and godless chatter. They worm their ways into homes and gain control over gullible women, and I'll explain that here in a second. But it's harmful action in the way of its speech, first of all, directed toward others. It's verbal and emotional abuse. The word slander actually is the word diabolos, which we get the word devil from. And so they speak like the devil to others. That is, they lie. They make false accusations. They are engaged in quarreling and gossiping. And then brutal means physical brutality, that which is savage and cruel and unmerciful in their treatment to others. We certainly see examples of brutality in our culture, even today. They are in relationship treacherous. In other words, they're like Judas. What did Judas do to Jesus? He betrayed Jesus. He was a traitor to Jesus and the other disciples. And this is the word, treacherous. And they live rash lives. That is, to live recklessly, to live without limits or boundaries. Who cares what the law says? I'm going to live the way I want to live. And they are fast talkers, and they seek then to move toward people who are weak and vulnerable and manipulate and victimize them. It says gullible women here, but I know that not just women are gullible, right? It's anyone who is weak and vulnerable. These people seek them out to take advantage of them and to harm them. How do we have a problem with con artists in this world? Yes, we do. And that's what he was speaking about. And then the fourth category he talks about is spiritual. It is a culture that is characterized by diseased spirituality. He says in this culture people will have a form of godliness but deny its power. Then he gives an Old Testament illustration. Just as Janez and Jambres, these were the Egyptian magicians who took on Moses. Remember when Moses went before Pharaoh and he threw it down his staff and it became a snake? Well, these two guys said, well, we can do that. And they did some magic too. But he's just using it as an illustration that the teachers that Timothy is going to face, they're going to oppose you just like those magicians did in Moses' day. They are men of depraved minds, who as far as the faith is concerned are rejected. They've made their decision. They're not fit to move forward with God. Their teaching will spread like what? Gangrene. What a horrible term. Such evil men and impostors will go from bad to worse. Are you feeling it already? I mean, Paul has given us a real load of negative stuff here. But this culture has religion, spirituality is at an all-time high in America. But here he talks about a religion that is for appearances only. It's outward. There's no real power to it. So this is hypocrisy. This is those that are now opposing Timothy and sound teaching. And their own teaching is being disseminated as gangrene. It's a sore that festers and is getting more rank and rancid and putrid as time passes by. And gangrene is something that, man, if you don't take care of it, it's going to kill you. Paul goes on, chapter 4. For Timothy, the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers. In other words, more than they need. A whole bucket load of teachers to do what? To tell them what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to this. And folks, he is telling them in a day where they didn't have the internet. I can tell you this with confidence. You can pick any topic you want. Marriage, divorce, abortion, death penalty, whatever. Type it in on the internet and you will have books and blogs and YouTube preachers and teachers that will be talking about those topics. And if you keep scrolling and listening, you're going to find someone who agrees with you. Right? They're out there. Just keep looking. And pretty soon, oh, that's the one I want to hear. Why? Because they say what I want them to say to me, to affirm my point of view. It's there. And Paul says that's the way toxic culture is. There's plenty of people out there going to tell you stuff. I tell parents this all the time. In fact, to the couple that's going to have their child dedicated to on Mother's Day, Sunday, I says, if you don't teach your child about God, somebody else will. Somebody else will. There's plenty of somebodies out there to give you spiritual information. And Paul is saying, watch out. So what can you do with this information about toxic culture? Paul tells Timothy what to do in verse 5. Right in the middle of that first tirade of descriptions, he says, Timothy, have nothing to do with them. I'm going, what? Have nothing to do with them. Today, let's go join the Amish, shall we? Is that what Paul is saying? Let's go separate and isolate ourselves from toxic culture. So let's start our own commune. Remember Jim Jones? He did that, right? Let's go off to Ghana and build this little utopian society. Should we do that? No, I don't think so. How about let's go to Alaska and live off the grid? You know, I like those shows that talk about people who do that. Man, is that what Paul is saying? Have nothing to do with them? Is that what Paul is saying here? To live under a rock, to cut your cable, to sell your TV, to stop the newspaper, and become some kind of religious ascetic? I looked it up. Bible commentators say that what Paul is saying to Timothy is, Timothy, don't invite such teachers into your home. That's what he's saying. Don't invite them into your home by way of the internet or by the TV or by the radio or when they knock on your front door. Don't invite them, these false teachers, into your home. Don't affirm them by giving them any of your time and attention. You know, Jesus brought up the phrase to be in the world but not of the world. And here's the verse. This is in his final prayer before he dies and before Judas comes and betrays him. He says in John 17, my prayer is not that you take them, that is his followers, his disciples, out of the world, out of the culture, but that you protect them in the culture from the evil one. They are not of this world, that is, not of this culture, even as I am not of it. And as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. So we talk about being in the world, but not of the world. But we have to be careful about that. We are not to be of this culture, But let's understand that Jesus has sent us to it. That we are to engage it. We are to seek to evangelize it. We are to be in the world and to be what? Salt and light. Positive influences in that which is dark and toxic. This is what Paul tells Timothy, even though that one phrase, but the rest of the book is all about what Timothy should be doing positively in his environment. Let me just give you a prelude of where we're going. He says, Timothy, because you live in a toxic culture, don't be ashamed to testify about the Lord. Join me in suffering for the gospel. You then, Timothy, because you live in a toxic culture, I want you to be strong, hence my title. Be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. Be ready to endure hard. It's not going to be easy. Timothy, because you live in a toxic culture, don't forget Jesus. Remember Jesus. Remember who Jesus is. God the Son who came to earth in his person, who died on the cross for the sins of the world and is resurrected. We celebrated that last Sunday. You're not going to make it in this culture if you don't have the presence and power of Jesus in your life. And so if that's your need today, then heed that one word. Remember Jesus. Invite Jesus to come into your life with his presence and his power, because you're going to need it. You're going to need it. He says, because you live in a toxic culture, Timothy, keep reminding them, who? Church people, about these things. That's what we're doing. But as for you, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced in. You're my apprentice. You're my mentor. Don't forget what I've taught you. You're going to need it. And last of all, Timothy, I give you this charge. Preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage, and yet do so with great patience and careful instruction. Timothy, you have something to do. I'm leaving this world. I'm leaving the world. I'm going to die, but you're going to stay in it. You've got things to do. And so these next 5 messages, we're going to go back through the letter, and I'm going to pick out all of those positive things that Paul tells Timothy to be about until he passes from this earth. And that's what these messages are going to take us to. So it's the pod. Today's the negative. Today's the bad news. After this, it's all good news. It's how to stand strong in this toxic culture. And then our church. What about us? How can we as a church, as a community of God's people, survive and thrive? And I want you to consider this phrase. Toxic culture equals post-Christian culture. Have you heard that term, post-Christian? It's not the 50s anymore, where culture was on the side of Christianity. Our culture is now against Christians. Just read your newspaper. We are in a post-Christian culture. Keep that in mind. What does Paul tell us? He tells Timothy, this is the last statement that he makes before he talks about his end of life. He says, Timothy, keep your head. Whatever you do, going forward, keep your head, church. Endure hardship, do the work of evangelists, and discharge all the duties of your ministry. To keep your head is just simply to be self-controlled, self-possessed. Don't let culture get to you. Don't let it infect you. Don't be LUI, living under the influence of the culture. But do the work of evangelists. In other words, keep announcing the good news of Jesus Christ. Keep pointing people to Jesus Christ. And get busy practicing what I've taught you. Discharge the duties of your ministry. We have things to do. And this letter is going to talk to us about all the things positively we can and should be doing in the current state of our culture as well. Whatever you do, keep your head. Don't quit. Don't retreat, but advance and engage the culture that God has placed us in. Let us pray. Dear Lord Jesus, I want to thank you again that we've had this time here today to talk about really a very negative topic, but Paul brings it up. And we want to use it to launch into that which is positive in our culture. And positive in what we as followers of Christ can bring into our environments. We're talking about maybe not the world stage, but the stage of our own neighborhood, the culture of our own families, how we can make a difference on our block, in our family gatherings. We can be salt and light. And so we're going to hear from Paul as to what he counsels this young man, Timothy, of how he can be strong in this terrible last days culture that he described so well for us today. Lord, if there's anyone here today who has been thinking about Christ and about if Christ is on the throne of their life, because itself needs to come off and Christ needs to be on that throne, and that is an intentional decision that must be made. He doesn't go there automatically. You have to invite Christ to be on the throne of your life, and that means you need to get off and allow Christ to come in and forgive you and begin to lead and direct your life. And if that's your desire today, then please just say that prayer. Just say, I'm putting myself off and I'm putting you on where you need to be. And I'm going to walk out of here a different person because I'll have Jesus as the one who's leading and guiding my life. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.